Yes, as far as the future trends are concerned, India is perched at a wonderful position because not only do we have the generic industry which is flourishing, but we also have a lot of activities that are happening in the background. For example, bio is really moving up the scale, and we also have the cell gene therapy, which could become a game changer as far as India is concerned. I would speak for India alone. I wouldn't speak for any other geography. Oh, that's a wonderful question about leadership in the industry. I think personally there has to be a shift in the way in which leadership is looked at, because leadership is not just limited to the hierarchy or the topmost hierarchy in the organization. It needs to be inbuilt into the system across the line of control, I would say, because as an operator, a person who's at the job also needs to have leadership in terms of having to do things right the first time, for which there is a huge amount of responsibility and accountability that needs to be cascaded into that level of the organization. So I think the limitations that the current profile of the industry is in looking at leadership with very myopic views, in having to develop people with skills and skill sets at a level which people consider as being at the top of the pyramid. But I would think that it would be required all across, and specifically so when decisions are to be made. Because strategic decisions could still be done at the top, but tactical decisions need to be across the hierarchy. That's a very interesting question about selecting a textile provider, because the current status is that nobody really pays attention to it. It's just the availability of a garment, and after that it's left to the in-house resources in order to look at garments. But considering Annex 1 and its implications with respect to contamination control strategies, I think garments become the frontline barriers as far as contamination control is concerned, because it's not very easy for us to wish away people from the operations, at least in the next 10-15 years. People would be an elementary part of operations. It might not be true for critical operations, but for the rest of the operations in a pharmaceutical setup, people would be an integral part. And that's when contamination starts to become a problem. So having to protect the environment, having to protect the people becomes crucial. And that's where the requirement of the textile manufacturer or the garment manufacturer becomes important. And I think Annex 1 is paving the way in terms of how people ought to relook at their methodologies and processes of selecting textile manufacturers. I think that's another wonderful question, because the tabular columns that are given in Annex 1 are pretty specific and very elaborate. Now, there is a difference in the kind of gowning that people have to be adopting based on the grades. And I will start with grade B, is where people are proximal to grade A, because there's no person who's allowed to be in grade A. So the quality of the gowns that's required for grade B has to be relooked very critically in terms of not just the material of construction, but also the reuse categories that people have. It's very easy for people to move into a single-use portfolio, but what happens with sustainability is a question that one would have, although Annex 1 doesn't talk about it. But as a customer of garments, I would probably endorse the fact that critical operations in grade B need to be equivalent or if not more as far as grade A operations are concerned. Therefore, the requirements for grade B is as stringent as what is required in grade A. But when you come down to grade C and D, there is a thought process that the industry has in saying that it's all right to be bringing the requirements down, kind of scaling it downwards. I would think that that would probably increase the contamination possibilities, because the moment you scale it down, the barrier mechanisms are also going to be scaled down. So equal emphasis on how people have to be choosing garments for grade D and C also become equally important, although this is not emphasized in Annex 1. But being logical and being practical in having to look at barrier systems that Annex 1 so talks about, it becomes easier for people to look at a good strategy to look at gowning, material, and the process of gowning in all three grades: grade D, grade C, and grade B. I think if you look at the pharmaceutical companies, the core competence is that of manufacturing. The process, what gets complicated is when you tend to bring everything that's surrounding manufacturing into the portfolio of manufacturing. So I would think that it will be smart for the industry to look at who would serve them easier or better with laundry management or with gowning activities, in terms of saying that it's an outsourced activity. When you look at the critical pathway of manufacturing, gowning is just going to be one of the measures where contamination can be controlled and therefore manufacturing proceeds. But if I tend to look at a backward integration, then I'm going to be spending a lot of money, time, resources in having that backward integrated part to be also in line with what manufacturing policies are. So my recommendation would be that the gowning be tied away or cut away from manufacturing, and therefore someone else is managing the gowning process. While pharmaceutical manufacturers are looking at critical processes of manufacturing and honing all their expertise, honing all the resources into that zone of looking at how manufacturing happens, rather than having to invest time, effort, energy about the gowning process itself. I know it's radically different, but I think that would be the smartest way to do things. It doesn't need the entire organization to be working on it. So the operator is told what the gowning is, the operator is informed about how gowns have to be handled, but the handling and the management of the garments is done by somebody else. I think in terms of the changes that the pharmaceutical industry need to make for the compliance to Annex 1, it's not much. But when you look at the nitty-gritty of it, which is go to the smaller things, I think there is a redesign that would be required. Because the way in which people gown as far as grade B is concerned, which is the critical area, is pretty good. But when you look at the non-classified area gowning, it's not in line with what is required or expected as far as Annex 1 is concerned. So I would think that we could classify that as two. One is critical operations, the other is non-critical operations. So the non-critical operations might need to be brought up as far as standards are concerned. One of the misconceptions that have been existing in the pharmaceutical industry is the fact that you don't need to pay attention to lower classified areas, the activities and the gowning processes at those areas, because anyway it's not in proximity with the products that are being manufactured. I think if that shift happens, and if controls and mechanisms of monitoring are increased in the periphery of the operations, the way in which contaminations could be controlled within the critical area will be much better, much higher, and with a lot more assurance in terms of having operations to be unsullied.